Hey guys, tonight we were going to sit in the dark with some giants. Not the Goliath kind, but the giants of faith, the names you hear on Sunday mornings that sound like they were carved from marble, unshakable and perfect. We're going to find the cracks. Imagine you're standing at the edge of a vast, silent desert at twilight. The sun has bled out below the horizon, and the first stars are punching tiny, cold holes in the indigo fabric above. There's a fire nearby, but it's not giving off any heat. It's a strange, impossible fire, and a voice is calling your name from the middle of it, giving you a task so immense, so far beyond your pay grade, that your first instinct isn't courage, but a cold, creeping dread. The voice of God is speaking, and all you can think is, you've got the wrong guy. Honestly, if you were in their shoes, Moses at the burning bush, Elijah under the broom tree, John the Baptist in his dungeon, you probably wouldn't survive this. Not with your faith or your sanity intact. These weren't just bad days, they were soul-crushing, identity-shattering moments of pure, unadulterated doubt. And that's exactly where we're going tonight. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It lets me know you're out there listening. In the comments, I'd love to see where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always a quiet thrill to see this little community scattered across the globe, all sharing this same space for a little while. I'm here in H, letter 1ED9, IN, Vietnam, and it's just a few minutes before 10 p.m. The lanterns outside are casting a warm glow on the street, and the night is settling in. To understand the depth of a man's doubt, you first have to understand the shape of his life. Not the life he was born into, but the one he has settled for. For Moses, that life was shaped by rocks and dust, by the rhythmic chewing of sheep, and by the vast, crushing silence of the Midianite wilderness. For 40 years, this had been his world. 40 years. Think about that. Most of us consider a decade a lifetime. 40 years is an eternity spent in the same quiet corner of the world, watching the same sun bake the same landscape, season after season. He was 80 years old. The fire of his youth, the passions and ambitions that burned in him as a prince of Egypt, had long since cooled to embers, buried under the ash of decades of routine. His life in Egypt was another man's story, a ghost he no longer conversed with. That man, the young Moses, had been raised in the opulence of Pharaoh's court. He was educated in the finest traditions of the world's greatest empire. He understood mathematics, architecture, military strategy, and the intricate dance of courtly politics. He was a man of power and privilege, wrapped in fine linen, his future seemingly paved with gold. But he was also a man with a secret, a Hebrew child saved from the river, living a lie in the very house that decreed the death of his people. That tension must have hummed beneath the surface of his entire youth, a quiet, constant dissonance. He was one of them, but not of them. He saw the suffering of his brethren from the windows of his chariot, the sting of the taskmasters whip a distant, abstract injustice until the day it wasn't. The day his carefully constructed world shattered. The day he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, and the quiet hum of dissonance roared into a murderous rage. In a flash of violence, he struck the Egyptian down and buried him in the sand, hopping to bury the deed with him. But secrets, especially bloody ones, have a way of surfacing. The next day, when he tried to intervene in a fight between two Hebrews, his secret was thrown back in his face. Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Are you going to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? The terror in that moment must have been absolute. Not just the fear of Pharaoh's wrath, which was lethal, but the deeper, more profound horror of being exposed, of being rejected by the very people he had tried to defend. His act of violent solidarity had backfired completely. He was an outsider to the Egyptians by blood, and now an outsider to the Hebrews by his act. He belonged nowhere. So he ran. He fled eastward, across the unforgiving Sinai Peninsula, until the shadow of Egypt could no longer touch him. He ran until he was just a man, stripped of his title, his power, and his identity, arriving at a well in the land of Midian with nothing but the clothes on his back and the ghost of a dead man in his memory. It was there that his second life began. He found a wife, Zipporah. He found a father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian. He found a new trade, a new rhythm. He became a shepherd. It's a profession that demands patience and humility, two things a prince of Egypt would have known little about. His days were no longer filled with decrees and political maneuvering, but with the bleating of sheep and the search for sparse patches of green grass. He learned the language of the wilderness, how the wind whistling through a canyon could foretell a sandstorm, where to find water hidden deep within a rocky crevice, which plants were poison, and which could soothe a wound. He learned the stars not as distant celestial bodies of religious significance, but as a map, a shepherd's reliable guide in the trackless dark. For 40 years he walked this land. His skin, once accustomed to the cool stone of the palace, became leathered and dark from the relentless sun. His hands, once soft, became calloused and strong from gripping his staff. He likely had a family, sons Gershom and Eliezer. He would have watched them grow, taught them the ways of the wilderness, and perhaps told them stories of a faraway land of rivers and pyramids, stories that must have sounded like pure fantasy. This was his life now. It was a simple life, a quiet one. A life of penance, perhaps. A life of forgetting. The man who thought he might be a deliverer, the man who acted with righteous fury, was gone. In his place was an old shepherd, content with his flock, his family, and the predictable cycle of the seasons. The ambition to save a nation had been replaced by the simple, daily responsibility of keeping a few dozen animals alive. He had made peace with his own smallness, with his obscurity. The great drama of his people's suffering in Egypt was a world away, a faint echo from a life he no longer lived. He had found a sort of peace in being a nobody, a man whose name the wind would carry away without a trace. And it was on just another one of these numbingly ordinary days that everything changed. He was on the far side of the wilderness, a place the Bible calls Horeb, the mountain of God. For Moses, it was likely just another mountain, another place to find grazing for his father-in-law's flock. He was leading them, his mind probably wandering, thinking about the evening meal or a lame ewe when he saw it. Out of the corner of his eye, a flicker of something strange. In a land where the sun bleaches everything to shades of beige and brown, any anomaly stands out. It was a bush, a common, thorny acacia bush, but it was on fire. This in itself wasn't entirely unusual. In the dry heat of the desert, lightning strikes or sparks could easily ignite the tinder-dry vegetation. But this fire was different. It wasn't consuming. He would have stopped, his hand resting on his staff, his eyes narrowing against the glare. A normal fire in the desert is a frantic, hungry thing. It crackles and spits, devouring the fuel, leaving behind a black, skeletal husk before quickly burning itself out. This fire was calm, steady. The flames licked and danced around the branches, clothing them in a vibrant, impossible light. Yet not a single leaf was blackened, not a single twig turned to ash. The bush was burning, but it was not consumed. It was a paradox, a quiet violation of the laws of nature that Moses had come to know so intimately over 4 decades. His shepherd's curiosity, the instinct that made him notice a single sheep straying from the flock, was piqued. I will turn aside and see this great sight, he thought, why the bush is not burned. Every great journey begins with a small decision, a choice to turn aside from the ordinary path. As he drew closer, the heat he would have expected to feel on his face was absent. There was no smell of smoke, no crackle of burning wood. There was only the silent, shimmering light. And then a voice that wasn't just heard with the ears, but felt in the bones, a voice that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the impossible fire. Moses, Moses, to hear your name called in the middle of nowhere is unsettling enough. To hear it called by a voice from a fire that shouldn't exist is a reality-bending experience. His reply was instinctual, a simple, trembling, "Here I am." He was present. He was listening. "Do not come any closer," the voice commanded. "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." This was the first indication that this was not just a natural wonder. This was a sacred encounter. The simple act of removing his sandals was an act of profound humility and reverence. It was an acknowledgement that he, a dusty shepherd, was standing in the presence of something pure, something other. The rough, calloused soles of his feet, which knew every rock and thorn of this wilderness, were now pressed against ground that had been consecrated by the divine. It was an act of surrender, of making himself vulnerable before the mystery. And in that moment of vulnerable silence, the voice identified itself. "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." At this, Moses hid his face. This was not just any deity, this was the God of his ancestors, the God of the covenant, the God whose stories he might have heard as a child from his mother Jochebed before she sent him down the river. The God his people were crying out to from their bondage. The weight of that name, that lineage, was immense. The stories of this God were of awesome, terrifying power. Jacob wrestled with him and was left with a permanent limp. Abraham was asked to sacrifice his own son. This was not a God to be trifled with. And so Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. He shielded his eyes from the glory of the fire, a gesture of a creature overwhelmed by the presence of his Creator. Then God spoke of the reason for this visitation. He had seen the misery of his people in Egypt. He had heard their cries. He was concerned about their suffering. And then came the sentence that would shatter Moses' quiet, forgotten life into a million pieces. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. The silence that followed must have been deafening, broken only by the sound of Moses' own heart hammering against his ribs. Go where? To Egypt, the place he had fled in terror 40 years ago, the place where he was a wanted man, a murderer. And do what? Confront Pharaoh, the living God, the absolute monarch of the most powerful empire on earth. To what end? To bring the Israelites out, a nation of slaves. It was not just an impossible task. It was ludicrous. It was a suicide mission, handed down by a voice in a magic fire. And this is where we find the first honest moment of doubt. The first of 5 desperate, beautifully human objections that Moses throws up like a shield against this overwhelming, terrifying commission. His response wasn't a noble, "Yes, Lord, I will go." It was a raw, unfiltered cry from the heart of a man who knew his own limitations all too well. "Who am I," he stammered, "that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" Let's sit with that question for a moment. Who am I? It's perhaps the most fundamental question of the human condition. It is the question of identity, of self-worth, of place in the world. And for Moses, at this moment, it was a question born of 40 years of exile and obscurity. Who was he? He was a shepherd. He was an 80-year-old man with a family. He was a fugitive from justice. He was a man with a stammer, a man who had long ago traded the scepter of a prince for the simple wood of a shepherd's crook. From his perspective, God could not have chosen a less qualified, less suitable candidate. He was looking at his own reflection and seeing only his deficiencies. He saw the murderer, not the man of conviction. He saw the exile, not the man who survived. He saw the aging shepherd, not the man raised with an insider's knowledge of the Egyptian court. He saw his slowness of speech, his brokenness, his complete and utter inadequacy. This wasn't false modesty. This was his honest, brutal self-assessment. He was looking at his resume, and it was filled with failure, running away, and 4 decades of professional sheep herding. The job description was liberator of a nation. His qualifications were keeps sheep from falling into ravines. The disconnect was absolute. This is the doubt of inadequacy. It's the voice that whispers to us when we're faced with a great challenge or opportunity. You're not smart enough. You're not strong enough. You don't have what it takes. They're going to find you out. It's imposter syndrome, canonized. Moses is the patron saint of everyone who has ever felt like a fraud. He looked at the mountain God was asking him to climb and felt he lacked the legs, the lungs, and the heart to even take the first step. "Who am I?" was not a request for information. It was a declaration of insufficiency. It meant, "You have the wrong man. I am nothing. I am nobody." And how did God respond to this crisis of identity? He didn't give Moses a pep talk. He didn't list Moses's hidden talents or remind him of his princely education. He didn't say, "You are Moses, and you are capable of great things." God's answer completely sidestepped Moses's question about his own identity. The divine response was simple and profound. "I will be with you." God didn't argue with Moses's self-assessment. Maybe Moses was right. Maybe, by all human standards, he was completely inadequate. But it didn't matter. The success of the mission did not depend on the question, "Who is Moses?" It depended entirely on the answer to the question, "Who is with Moses?" God shifts the entire basis of qualification from Moses's ability to God's presence. The focus moves from the servant's resume to the master's power. It's not about who you are. It's about whose you are. The reason you can do this, God is saying, is not because you are great, but because I am. My presence will be your qualification. My power will be your strength. As a sign that this would be true, God offers a glimpse of the future. "And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this very mountain." It's a beautiful, almost cruel promise. The proof that God sent him on this impossible journey would only be visible after the impossible journey was completed. He had to operate on pure faith, trusting that the presence promised to him now would be sufficient to bring him back to this very spot, not as a lonely shepherd, but as the leader of a liberated nation. It was an answer that offered no comfort to Moses's ego, but infinite comfort to his spirit, if he could only accept it. But Moses wasn't there yet. His practical human mind was still reeling, still searching for a way out. He moves from the problem of his identity to the problem of God's identity, at least as it would be perceived by others. This is his second objection. Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, "The God of your fathers has sent me to you," and they ask me, "What is his name?" Then what shall I tell them? This sounds like a reasonable question, but it's deeper than it appears. In the ancient world, a name was not just a label. A name contained the essence, the character, the power of the person. To know someone's name was to have a measure of insight into their nature, and in the case of a deity, a measure of access to their power. The Egyptians had a whole pantheon of gods with names and defined roles. Ra, the sun god, Osiris, the god of the underworld, Isis, the goddess of magic. Their roles were understood. Their powers were, if not controllable, at least categorized. Moses was being sent to people who had been immersed in this polytheistic culture for 400 years. They were slaves, and their ancestral God had been silent for centuries. If Moses, a long-lost brother, showed up out of nowhere claiming a divine commission, their first and most logical question would be, which God are we talking about? And what is his power? What is his nature? Is he stronger than the gods of Pharaoh? They would need a name to latch onto, a name to believe in. So when Moses asks, "What is his name?" he is asking for credentials. He's asking for a handle on this overwhelming presence in the fire. Who are you, really? Give me something I can use, something I can present, something tangible. And God's answer is perhaps the most profound and mysterious statement in the entire Old Testament. God said to Moses, "I am who I am," or "I will be what I will be." In Hebrew, the phrase is Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. He then shortens it. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. This is a name that is not a name. It's a statement of absolute, self-sufficient, uncaused being. It's a divine refusal to be categorized or defined by human terms. The Egyptian gods had names that linked them to a function, the sun, the harvest, the river. This God's name is simply existence itself. He is not the God of the mountains. He is the one who is. He is not the God of the storms. He simply is. He is the ultimate reality, the ground of all being. He is not one power among many. He is the source of all power. When Moses asks for a name he can control or define, God gives him a name that is pure, untamable verb. I am the one who is, who was, and who always will be. My nature is to exist and to act. When you need a deliverer, I will be your deliverer. When you need a provider, I will be your provider. I will be whatever my people need me to be. It was a staggering, revolutionary concept. He was to go to the Israelites and Pharaoh, not in the name of a local deity, but in the name of being itself. This was the authority he was to carry. The supreme being of the universe was personally invested in this mission. It was an answer of breathtaking scope, designed to obliterate Moses' doubt about his authority. But for a trembling shepherd standing barefoot on a mountain, it might have felt terrifyingly abstract. He wanted a shield, and God handed him the sky. His mind, ever practical, ever doubtful, immediately jumped to the next hurdle. Okay, so I have a name, an unname. But what if they just don't believe me? What if they laugh in my face? His third objection is one of credibility. What if they do not believe me or listen to me and say, "The Lord did not appear to you"? This is the fear of rejection, a fear Moses knew intimately. The last time he tried to act on behalf of his people, they had rejected him. Who made you a prince and a judge over us? The sting of that memory was likely still fresh, even after 40 years. Why would this time be any different? He was still the same man, just older and dustier. He would show up with a fantastic story about a talking, non-burning bush and a god named I Am. It was a recipe for ridicule. He needed proof. He needed something more than words. He needed a sign. And God, in his patient condescension to human weakness, provides. "What is that in your hand?" the Lord asked. "A staff," Moses replied. It was the most ordinary object in his life, his tool of the trade, an extension of his own arm. He used it to guide his sheep, to lean on when he was tired, to protect himself from predators. It was a simple piece of wood, worn smooth by his own hand over countless years. "Throw it on the ground," God commanded. Moses obeyed, and the moment the staff hit the dirt, it transformed. The familiar wood writhed, twisted, and became a snake, hissing and slithering at his feet. The scripture says Moses ran from it. This was not some gentle, symbolic transformation. This was terrifying. His most trusted tool, the symbol of his simple shepherd's life, had become a creature of danger, a symbol of chaos, and in the Egyptian mind, a symbol of divine and royal power, the cobra on Pharaoh's crown. It was a sign that God could take the ordinary, the familiar, the mundane, and invest it with terrifying, untamable power. "Reach out your hand and take it by the tail," God said. Every instinct in Moses's body must have screamed no. You don't grab a snake, especially a venomous one, by the tail. It's the quickest way to get bitten. But this whole encounter was about trusting the voice over his own instincts. With his heart pounding, he reached down, his fingers closing around the scaly tail, and in his grasp, it instantly became rigid and wooden again. It was his staff once more, familiar and solid in his hand. The power was now controllable, available to him through obedience. God wasn't finished. He gave him a second sign, one that was deeply personal. "Put your hand inside your cloak." Moses did so. "Now take it out." When he drew his hand out, it was covered with leprosy, the skin flaky and white as snow. It was a terrifying, unclean disease, a symbol of death and decay. He stared in horror at his own hand, so alien and diseased. Then God said, "Now put it back into your cloak." He did, and when he withdrew it again, it was restored, healthy and whole as the rest of his flesh. This was a sign of God's power over life and death, over sickness and health. It was a demonstration that the God who was sending him was the master of the human body itself. He could strike with disease, and he could heal. If the people wouldn't believe the sign of the staff, they would surely believe this one. And if they still didn't believe, God gave him a third sign to perform once he got to Egypt. He was to take water from the Nile and pour it on the ground, where it would turn to blood. The lifeblood of Egypt, their sacred river, would become a symbol of death at his command. 3 signs, concrete, powerful, miraculous proof. God had systematically addressed Moses's fears. "Who am I?" God answered. "I will be with you." "What is your name?" God answered. "I am." "What if they don't believe me?" God answered. "I will give you my power to perform signs." Every logical objection had been met with a divine, supernatural provision. Moses was out of excuses, or so it would seem. But doubt is rarely purely logical. It often comes from a deeper, more personal place of insecurity. And now, with all his practical objections dismantled, Moses unveils the real, raw heart of his reluctance. His 4th objection is his most vulnerable. "Pardon your servant, Lord. I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue." This is the core of it. This is the insecurity that had likely plagued him his entire life. The leader of a nation, the emissary to Pharaoh, needs to be a great orator. He needs to be persuasive, charismatic, powerful in his speech. And Moses is saying, "That's not me. I can't do it. I stumble over my words. I'm not a public speaker. Some scholars believe he may have had a literal speech impediment, a stutter. Others believe he was simply not a gifted communicator, perhaps feeling linguistically insecure after 40 years of speaking a different dialect in Midian, his courtly Egyptian rusty and forgotten. Whatever the cause, the feeling was real and debilitating. It was the one inadequacy that the signs and wonders couldn't fix. The staff could turn into a snake, but his tongue was still his tongue. It's such a human moment. After witnessing a bush that burns but isn't consumed, after hearing the name of God revealed, after holding a snake staff in his hand, and seeing his own flesh healed of leprosy, he is still stuck on his own personal flaw. It shows how deeply our insecurities are rooted in us, how they can blind us even to the evidence of miracles. He's essentially saying, God, you are all-powerful, I see that. But you don't understand. I'm a terrible public speaker. At this point, you can feel a shift in the tone of God's response. The patience is still there, but it is now tinged with a sharp edge of divine frustration. Who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I will help you speak and will teach you what to say. It's a powerful rebuke. God is saying, are you seriously lecturing me, the creator of mouths, about your mouth? Do you think I am unaware of your limitations? Do you think I made a mistake? I am the one who designed you. Your weakness is not a surprise to me. It is not an obstacle to my plan. God again reinforces the central message. It is not about Moses' ability, but God's. I will help you speak. I will teach you what to say. The creator of the tongue will give him the words. The source of all communication will be his prompter. This should have been the final, definitive answer. The promise that resolves all fear. Moses has been given God's presence, God's name, God's power, and now God's own words. Every single base has been covered. And yet, Moses' doubt, his deep-seated fear, his overwhelming desire not to be the chosen one, is so profound that he makes one final, desperate plea. He gives up on giving reasons. He abandons all pretense of logic. His fifth and final objection is just a raw cry of surrender to his own fear. Pardon your servant, Lord. Please send someone else. That's it. That's all he has left. Please, not me. Anyone but me. It is the most honest moment of them all. He's not questioning God's power anymore. He's not questioning his own qualifications. He's simply begging to be let off the hook. The weight of the commission is too much. The fear of failure, of rejection, of returning to the scene of his greatest trauma is too overwhelming. He just doesn't want to do it. And the Bible says that at this, the Lord's anger burned against Moses. For the first time, God's patience has run out. After all the reassurance, all the signs, all the promises, Moses' refusal to trust is a deep offense. Yet even in his anger, God shows a measure of grace. He doesn't revoke the commission. He doesn't strike Moses down. He makes a concession. He accommodates Moses' persistent weakness. What about your brother, Aaron the Levite? I know he can speak well. He is already on his way to meet you, and he will be glad to see you. You shall speak to him and put words in his mouth. I will help both of you speak and will teach you what to do. He will speak to the people for you, and it will be as if he were your mouth and as if you were God to him. It is a solution, but it's a compromised one. Moses got what he wanted in a way. He got a partner, a mouthpiece. He wouldn't have to face the crowds or Pharaoh alone, but he also lost something. He was meant to be God's sole prophet, the direct vessel. God's original plan was, I will be with your mouth. Now, because of his doubt, it would be a shared role. Aaron, the eloquent one, would be brought in. And as the story unfolds, Aaron's presence will be both a blessing and, at times, a great curse, most notably when he forges the golden calf precisely, because he is more swayed by the crowd than his hesitant, mountain-bound brother. Moses' doubt had a consequence, a change in the plan. God would still accomplish his purpose, but the path would be different, altered by this moment of fearful refusal at the foot of a burning bush. So the argument is over. Moses has run out of objections, and God has provided a final, non-negotiable solution. The fire in the bush likely subsides, the voice falls silent, and Moses is left standing alone in the vast wilderness, the sandals in his hand, the ordinary-looking staff in the other, and the impossible weight of a divine commission settled upon his 80-year-old shoulders. The silence that returns is not the peaceful, monotonous silence of his shepherd's life. It is a new silence, humming with the energy of what has just transpired, pregnant with the terrifying future that now awaits him. He had to pick up his sandals, put them back on his feet, and walk back to his flock, walk back to his tent, walk back to his father-in-law, Jethro, and somehow try to explain that his 40-year retirement was over, that a bush had caught fire and spoken to him, and that he now had to go and pick a fight with the most powerful man on earth. The doubt could not have vanished in an instant. It surely walked with him, a cold companion on the journey back down the mountain. But underneath the doubt, a tiny, fragile seed of obedience had been planted. He had argued, he had resisted, he had begged. But he had not, in the end, said no. He was going to go. The aging, broken, insecure shepherd, the man who was sure God had the wrong guy, was going to go. And that reluctant, terrified, doubt-filled yes would be the first step in changing the course of human history. If Moses' doubt was the intellectual and personal crisis of an educated man faced with a task beyond his qualifications, our next story brings us down to the dirt floor of human experience. We move from the majestic solitude of God's mountain to the damp, musty fear of a hole in the ground. Here, doubt isn't a philosophical objection. It's a gut-level reaction to trauma, a cynicism born from years of relentless suffering. This is the story of Gideon, and his doubt is the kind that grows in the dark, like a pale fungus, when hope has been starved of light for too long. To understand Gideon, you must first understand the terror of the harvest. For 7 years, the people of Israel had been living in a nightmare that repeated itself with the grim predictability of the seasons. The story takes place during the time of the Judges, a dark and chaotic era in Israel's history. It was a brutal cycle. The people would forget God and turn to the idols of their neighbors. God would allow a foreign power to oppress them. The people would cry out in their misery, and God would raise up a deliverer, a judge, to save them. Then, for a generation, there would be peace until the cycle began again. When we meet Gideon, his people are deep in the oppression phase of the cycle. The enemy wasn't a formal, occupying army like the Egyptians. In some ways, it was worse. The enemies were the Midianites, the Amalekites, and other nomadic tribes from the eastern deserts. They were raiders, a ravenous horde that swarmed into the land each year when the crops were ripe for harvest. The Bible describes them in terrifying, elemental terms. They poured into the land like locusts. It was impossible to count them or their camels. They were a force of nature, a devouring plague that swept across the fertile valleys of Israel. Imagine the scene. You've spent the year plowing the hard soil, carefully planting your seeds, tending the shoots, praying for rain, and watching your fields of barley and wheat turn from green to gold under the hot sun. This harvest is everything. It's your food for the next year. It's your family's survival. A knot of anxiety tightens in your stomach as the grain ripens, because you know they are coming. You watch the eastern horizon, and one day you see it, a vast cloud of dust. Then you hear it, the distant, thunderous sound of thousands of camel hooves, the war cries of a people who have come not to conquer, but simply to take everything you have. They wouldn't just take the grain. They would strip the land bare. They took the sheep, the cattle, the donkeys. They left nothing. They were so thorough that the Bible says they ruined the land. For 7 years, this happened. The Israelites, once a proud people, were reduced to the level of scavengers in their own country. They abandoned their villages on the valley floors and fled to the hills. They lived in caves, in mountain clefts, in makeshift strongholds, anywhere they could hide. They became a people of the shadows, their national spirit crushed, their bodies weakened by poverty and malnutrition. And where was their God in all this? The God who had split the Red Sea and brought down the walls of Jericho. He was silent. The heavens were brass. Their suffering felt like abandonment. This prolonged, systemic trauma had eroded their faith, leaving behind a bitter sediment of resentment and doubt. They cried out to the Lord, the Bible tells us, but it seems to have been the desperate cry of a people who no longer truly expected an answer. They were beaten, broken, and terrified. It is in this world of fear and scarcity that we find our hero. And the Bible introduces him in the least heroic way imaginable. We don't find him on a battlefield, rallying troops. We don't find him in a sanctuary, praying for deliverance. We find Gideon, son of Joash, in a winepress, secretly thrashing a little bit of wheat. Let's unpack the profound desperation in that single image. A winepress was a pit, often carved into rock, where grapes were trampled to extract their juice. It was a confined, sunken space. Thrashing wheat, on the other hand, was supposed to be done out in the open, on a high, windy thrashing floor. You would toss the grain into the air, and the wind would carry away the light, useless chaff, while the heavier, valuable kernels of wheat fell back to the floor. It was a public, communal activity, a celebration of the harvest's bounty. Gideon is doing this vital task in a hole in the ground. He's in the wine press, so the Midianite patrols won't see him. He's not flinging the grain into the wind. He's likely beating the stalks with a stick in a cramped, airless space, trying to separate a pitifully small amount of grain from its husk without attracting attention. This is not a man preparing for a feast. This is a man trying to hide enough food to keep his family from starving. He is the very embodiment of his nation's condition, hidden, fearful, and diminished. He is not a mighty warrior. He is a man hiding in a hole, hoping the bullies don't see him and steal his lunch money. And it is into this pathetic scene that God chooses to enter. An angel of the Lord appears and sits under a nearby oak tree. He watches Gideon for a moment, this man frantically and furtively beating his grain. Then the angel speaks, and his words are so wildly incongruous with the reality of the situation that they border on sarcastic. The Lord is with you, mighty warrior. Mighty warrior. Gideon must have frozen his stick in midair. He would have looked around wildly, his heart leaping into his throat. Was it a Midianite? A trap? He sees the figure sitting calmly under the tree, a stranger radiating an aura of otherworldly authority. And he hears the greeting again in his mind. Mighty warrior. It was a joke, a cruel, bitter joke. He was the opposite of a mighty warrior. He was a hider. He was a thresher in a hole. And the first part of the greeting was even more outrageous. The Lord is with you. Gideon's response is not one of awe or reverence. He doesn't fall on his face like Moses did. Instead, all the pent-up frustration, the bitterness, the theological confusion of the last 7 years comes pouring out of him. His reply is laced with a cynicism that is painfully real. Pardon me, my lord, he says, the formal address dripping with sarcasm. But if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? This is the raw cry of a person whose experience of suffering seems to directly contradict the promise of God's presence. It's the ancient version of the problem of evil, voiced not by a philosopher in a study, but by a starving man in a ditch. If God is good, why is there so much pain? If God is with us, why does it feel so much like he's abandoned us? Gideon continues, his voice rising with the memory of past glory. Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, "Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt?" But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian. He is a man haunted by the stories of his faith, stories that now seem like cruel fairy tales. The God of the Exodus was a God of power and action. The God of his own time was a God of silence and absence. His doubt is not about his own inadequacy, like Moses's was. His doubt is about God's character and God's faithfulness. He's not asking, "Who am I?" He's asking, "Who are you? And where have you been?" The angel's response is to pivot directly to the absurd. Instead of answering Gideon's legitimate theological complaint, the Lord for the text now shifts from the angel to the Lord speaking directly looks at him and says, "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" The whiplash must have been staggering. Gideon has just delivered a passionate speech about his own weakness and God's abandonment, and the divine response is, "Okay, great, you're hired. Go save everyone." Notice the phrasing, "Go in the strength you have." What strength is that? The strength of a frightened man beating wheat in a winepress. The strength of a cynic. It's a divine command that seems to mock his condition. But it's also a profound statement. God is saying, "I'm not waiting for you to become a hero. I'm going to use you right now, just as you are, in your weakness and your fear. Your strength is insufficient, but it's the starting point. My sending you is what will make the difference." But Gideon, like Moses before him, immediately recoils. If his first objection was theological, his second is deeply personal, echoing Moses's cry of inadequacy. "Pardon me, my Lord, but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." This is the protest of the insignificant. Manasseh was not one of the more powerful or prestigious tribes of Israel, like Judah or Ephraim. And within that unremarkable tribe, Gideon's clan was the weakest link. And within that weak clan, his own family was at the bottom of the social ladder. And in that family, he was the least, perhaps the youngest son, the one with no inheritance, no standing, no influence. He's painting a picture of himself at the absolute bottom of the socio-political food chain. "You're not just scraping the bottom of the barrel, God," he's saying. "You're digging in the dirt underneath it. There is no one less important, less qualified than me." The Lord's reply is the exact same reassurance he gave to Moses. He doesn't argue with Gideon's assessment of his own status. He simply says, "I will be with you." Once again, God shifts the basis of success from the hero's resume to the divine presence. And he adds a promise, "And you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive." The promise is absolute, but for the man hiding in the winepress, it sounds like pure fantasy. At this point, Gideon is still not convinced he's talking to a divine messenger. For all he knows, this is just a charismatic stranger, or maybe even a madman. He needs proof. His doubt is intensely practical. "If I have now found favor in your eyes," he says, "give me a sign that it is really you talking to me." He asks the stranger to wait while he prepares an offering. He brings out a young goat and some unleavened bread, a lavish, sacrificial meal for a man in a time of famine. He is testing the encounter, putting his scarce resources on the line. He lays the meat and bread on a rock. The angel tells him to touch the offering with the tip of the staff that was in his hand. When he does, fire flares up from the rock and consumes the offering completely. And then, in a flash, the angel of the Lord disappears. The reality of the situation crashes down on Gideon. He has not just been speaking to a messenger, he has seen God face to face. A wave of terror washes over him, based on the old belief that no one could see God and live. "Alas, sovereign Lord, I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face," he cries out. But a voice of peace reassures him, "Peace, "Do not be afraid. You are not going to die." In response, Gideon builds an altar on that spot. He names it Yahweh Shalom, the Lord is peace. It's his first, tentative step of faith, a declaration that in the midst of a world of violence and fear, he has encountered a God of peace. But God doesn't leave him to contemplate this peaceful thought for long. That very night, his faith is put to an immediate, terrifying test. Before you go and fight the Midianites, God says, you have to clean your own house first. God commands him to take his father's second bull and use it to tear down his father's altar to the pagan god Baal. He is also to cut down the Asherah pole beside it, a wooden symbol of a Canaanite fertility goddess. Then, on the very spot where these symbols of apostasy stood, he is to build a proper altar to the Lord and sacrifice the bull on it, using the wood of the Asherah pole for the fire. This was an incredibly dangerous command. This wasn't just a private act of piety. It was a public act of war against the prevailing culture. The altar of Baal belonged to his own father, Josh. It was the town's official place of worship. To destroy, it was an act of high treason and blasphemy against the gods his community believed were protecting them. It was a direct challenge to his father's authority and his town's religious identity. They would surely kill him for it. Gideon's reaction shows that his encounter with the angel did not instantly erase his fear. He is obedient, but he is still terrified. The Bible tells us he was afraid of his family and the townspeople, so he did it at night rather than in the daytime. He gathers 10 of his servants, and under the cover of darkness, they commit this great act of religious vandalism and consecration. It's a beautiful picture of fearful faith. He's scared to death, but he does it anyway. His faith isn't a fearless roar. It's a whisper that chooses to obey in the dark. The next morning, the town is in an uproar. Their sacred sites are destroyed. When they discover Gideon is the culprit, they drag him before his father and demand his execution. "Bring out your son," they shout. "He must die because he has broken down Baal's altar and cut down the Asherah pole beside it." But something has changed in his father, Josh. Perhaps seeing his son's courage, or perhaps having a crisis of faith himself, he stands up to the mob. In a moment of brilliant, sarcastic logic, he says, "Are you going to plead Baal's case? If Baal really is a god, he can defend himself when someone breaks down his altar." He gives his son a new name that day, Jerubbaal, meaning let Baal contend with him. It was a challenge. And when Baal failed to strike Gideon down, Gideon's reputation and the reputation of his God began to grow. Now the main event begins. The Midianites and their allies sweep into the land once more, setting up their vast camp in the valley of Jezreel. And the Bible says, the Spirit of the Lord came on Gideon. It's a moment of divine empowerment. Filled with this new spirit, Gideon blows a trumpet, the ancient call to arms, and men from his own and neighboring tribes begin to rally to his side. An army of 32,000 Israelites assembles, a staggering number for a people who had been hiding in caves. It must have been an exhilarating sight. For the first time, Gideon might have felt a surge of confidence. Maybe, just maybe, this was possible. But as he looked out at the faces of his soldiers, and then across the valley at the endless sea of the Midianite camp, the old, familiar fear and doubt came creeping back in. The Spirit of the Lord was on him, but the mind of Gideon was still his own. The odds were still astronomical. The weight of leadership, the responsibility for thousands of lives, settled on him. And he found that his faith was not yet strong enough to carry that weight. He needed more. He needed absolute certainty. And this brings us to the famous and often misunderstood story of the fleece. Gideon comes before God with a proposition. It's a bargain, a request for a sign so specific and so personal that it could not be misinterpreted. If you will save Israel by my hand as you have promised, he says, look, I will place a wool fleece on the thrashing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you said. He's asking for a miracle in miniature, a controlled, scientific experiment in divine reassurance. He wants God to manipulate the laws of nature on a 2-foot patch of wool. Dew forms when the ground cools at night, causing moisture in the air to condense on it. For the ground to remain perfectly dry, while a porous, absorbent fleece becomes saturated with water, is a gentle but profound reversal of the natural order. He places the fleece on the hard-packed earth of the thrashing floor, the very place where he should have been thrashing his wheat, and he waits. That must have been a long, sleepless night. He would have paced, prayed, and worried, his mind a whirlwind of hope and fear. Was this foolish? Presumptuous? What if nothing happened? What if he woke up to a dry fleece and dry ground? Would the whole enterprise be over? Early the next morning, as the first gray light of dawn broke over the hills, he went to the thrashing floor. He knelt. He reached out a trembling hand. The ground around the fleece was dusty and dry, but the fleece itself was heavy with moisture. He picked it up and squeezed it, and a whole bowlful of water poured out onto the ground. It was an undeniable miracle, a direct, personal, and tangible answer to his prayer. The sign had been given. His doubt should have been erased. He should have been ready to march into battle. But he wasn't. The human mind, especially a mind conditioned by fear, is a stubborn thing. One miracle, it seems, was not enough to overwrite 7 years of trauma. A new thought began to creep into his mind. Wool is naturally absorbent. The ground is hard and non-porous. Maybe it wasn't a miracle at all. Maybe there was just enough dew in the air to saturate the wool, but not enough to be visible on the ground. Maybe he had just witnessed a perfectly natural, if unusual, phenomenon. The doubt, which had been silenced for a moment, began to whisper again. And so Gideon goes back to God, this time with an apology on his lips. He knows he is pushing his luck. Do not be angry with me, he begins, fully aware of his own audacity. Let me make just one more request. Allow me one more test with the fleece. This time, he wants to reverse the conditions, to create a scenario that is not just unnatural, but anti-natural. This time, make the fleece dry and the ground all around it be covered with dew. This second test is far more conclusive. for a piece of absorbent wool to remain bone dry, while the non-absorbent ground all around it is soaked with moisture, would be a definitive, irrefutable sign. There would be no room left for rationalization or doubt. This is the heart of Gideon's struggle. He isn't trying to trick God or bargain for power. He is a man who is desperately, honestly trying to build a foundation of faith strong enough to stand on in the face of certain death. He knows the battle ahead is unwinnable by human standards. He knows that to lead these men into that valley is a suicide mission unless God is truly, unequivocally with them. His testing is not a sign of disrespect, but a sign of how seriously he is taking God's command. He needs a faith that is more real than the tens of thousands of enemy soldiers camped in the valley below. God, in his incredible patience and understanding of human frailty, agrees. He is not offended by Gideon's weakness. He condescends to meet him in his place of desperate need. So Gideon waits through another long, anxious night. The next morning, he returns to the thrashing floor. The sight that met his eyes must have taken his breath away. The entire thrashing floor, the hard-packed earth, was dark with moisture, glistening with dew in the morning sun. But the fleece, when he picked it up, was light, fluffy, and perfectly dry. That was it, the final piece of proof. God had performed a quiet, impossible miracle twice, just for him. The whispers of doubt were finally silenced, replaced by a quiet, solid certainty. God was with him. The promise was real. Now he was ready. But just as Gideon's confidence solidifies, God pulls the rug out from under him. He looks at Gideon's army of 32,000 men and says, "You have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me. My own strength has saved me." This is a master class in how God builds faith. God has just spent all this time and energy building up Gideon's confidence, and now he systematically begins to dismantle any possible source of that confidence other than himself. An army of 32,000 against the Midianite horde was already a long shot. But it was a shot. There was a glimmer of military possibility. God is about to extinguish that glimmer. He is engineering a situation where victory will be so statistically impossible that only he could get the credit. He gives Gideon the first instruction. Announce to the army, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead. Gideon has to stand before his troops and essentially give permission to the cowards to desert. It must have been a gut-wrenching order to give. He needed every man he could get, but he obeyed, and 22,000 men turned around and walked away. 2/3 of his army vanished in an instant. He was left with 10,000 men. He must have watched them go with a sinking heart. The confidence he had gained from the fleece must have felt very fragile indeed. But God wasn't done. "There are still too many men," he said. He instructs Gideon to take the remaining 10,000 men down to the water to drink. There, God would separate them. God explains the test. Separate those who lap the water with their tongues, as a dog laps from those who kneel down to drink. So Gideon watches as his soldiers quench their thirst. Most of them, weary and hot, likely knelt down, put their faces to the water, and drank deeply. But a small handful, perhaps the more alert, combat-ready soldiers, simply cupped the water in their hands and lapped it from their hands, their eyes still up, scanning their surroundings. It was a test of military readiness, and the number of men who drank from their hands, the elite, watchful soldiers, 300. With the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands, God declared. Let all the others go home. And so, another 9,700 men were sent away. Gideon was left with a tiny band of 300 soldiers, a rounding error, a suicide squad. He was standing on a mountainside, looking down at an enemy as thick as locusts, whose camels were as numerous as the sand on the seashore, and his army was 300 men. Every ounce of human logic, military strategy, and self-preservation would have screamed at him to run. All the doubts that the fleece had so carefully quieted must have come roaring back with a vengeance. This wasn't a battle plan. It was a death sentence. And God, in his infinite wisdom and kindness, knew it. He knew that despite the signs, despite the shrunken army, Gideon was standing on a razor's edge of terror on the night before the battle. So he offers one more sign. This one is unsolicited. It is a pure gift of grace. Get up, the Lord said to him. Go down against the camp, because I am going to deliver it into your hands. If you are afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah and listen to what they are saying. Afterward, you will be encouraged to attack the camp. Notice the gentleness. If you are afraid, God knows he is afraid. He doesn't condemn him for it. Instead, he provides a final, perfect antidote for his fear. So Gideon and his servant creep down the mountainside under the cover of darkness. They approach the edge of the vast Midianite camp. The sounds and smells would have been overwhelming, the murmur of thousands of voices, the snorting of camels, the smell of cooking fires and livestock. It was the sound of an insurmountable force. As they hid in the shadows, they overheard 2 Midianite sentries talking. One man was telling the other about a dream he'd had. A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp, the soldier said. It struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed. It was a strange, almost comical dream. A loaf of barley bread, the food of the poor, the food of the starving Israelites, destroying a Midianite military tent. But his companion's interpretation, delivered in the dead of night, in the heart of the enemy camp, was a direct word from God into Gideon's terrified soul. The other soldier replied, This can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon son of Joash, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands. In that moment, everything clicked into place. God had given him a sign of confirmation from the mouth of the enemy itself. They were not confident, they were afraid of him, the man who had been hiding in a winepress. This final, intimate gift of reassurance was the turning point. It was so personal, so perfectly tailored to his moment of ultimate need, that it shattered the last remnants of his doubt. The Bible says, When Gideon heard the dream and its interpretation, he bowed down and worshipped. His fear was finally and completely transformed into faith. He went back to his 300 men, no longer a hesitant, doubt-filled leader, but a man of decisive, God-inspired action. "Get up," he commanded them. "The Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands." The battle plan that followed was as absurd as the dream of the barley loaf. He gave each of his 300 men a trumpet, an empty clay jar, and a torch to hide inside the jar. They were to surround the camp, and on his signal, they would all blow their trumpets, smash their jars, and hold up their torches, shouting, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." It was a strategy of psychological warfare, a plan designed to create maximum chaos and confusion, a plan that relied entirely on God turning the enemy against themselves. And it worked. The Midianites, awakened from sleep by the terrifying noise and light coming from all directions, panicked and began fighting each other in the darkness. Gideon's 300 men didn't have to lift a sword. Their victory was won not by their strength, but by their leader's willingness to trust God, even when it made no sense, a trust that had been patiently and painstakingly built by a God who was willing to meet a doubter in his fear and prove himself again and again and again. We have walked with Moses through the doubt of inadequacy, the feeling of being too small for the task. We have sat with Gideon in the darkness of his fear, watching him bargain for a faith strong enough to face the impossible. Now we turn to a different kind of doubt, a more insidious and perhaps more modern form of despair. It's the doubt that doesn't precede the battle, but follows the victory. It's the hollow ache that comes after the adrenaline has faded, the spiritual exhaustion that can crush even the strongest soul. This is the doubt born from burnout, from loneliness, and from the terrifying realization that even your greatest triumphs might not be enough to change the world. To understand this, we must journey into the wilderness with one of the most powerful and fiery prophets in the entire Bible, Elijah. And we must find him not at his strongest, but at his most broken. First, you must understand the world that forged Elijah into a man of flint and fire. He lived and prophesied in the northern kingdom of Israel, several generations after the nation had split in two. The northern kingdom had a long and sorry history of wicked kings, but none were as systematically, enthusiastically evil as the reigning monarch, Ahab. And the driving force behind Ahab's wickedness was his wife, Jezebel. She was not an Israelite. She was a Phoenician princess, the daughter of the king of Sidon, and she brought her religion with her. She was a fanatical worshiper of the pagan god Baal, the god of storms and fertility, and his consort, the goddess Asherah. Under Ahab and Jezebel, Baal worship was not just tolerated, it became the official state religion. It was a brutal, sensual, and demanding cult. Its rituals were a dark mirror of the worship of Yahweh. Where Yahweh demanded justice and mercy, Baal worship often involved frenzied ecstatic states, ritual prostitution, and in its most extreme forms, child sacrifice. Jezebel launched a systematic, violent persecution of the prophets of the Lord. She had them hunted down and executed, seeking to extinguish the last embers of Israel's true faith. Public worship of Yahweh became a capital crime. The nation was drowning in a sea of apostasy, led by a king who did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than did all the kings of Israel before him. Into this spiritual darkness, Elijah appears like a lightning strike. We know nothing of his background, only that he is Elijah the Tishbite. He strides onto the stage of history, confronts King Ahab directly, and delivers a devastating proclamation from God. As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years, except at my word. And then he vanishes. For 3.5 years, the skies over Israel are like iron. A catastrophic drought grips the land, a direct assault on the authority of Baal, who was supposed to be the god of rain and fertility. The land withers, the crops fail, and the nation starves. All the while, Ahab and Jezebel hunt for Elijah, the man they blame for their suffering. Elijah, for his part, is kept alive by a series of miracles fed by ravens at a lonely brook, and later sustained by a jar of flour and a jug of oil that never run out in the home of a pagan widow in the heart of enemy territory. For 3.5 years, Elijah is a man on the run, a solitary voice of truth in a nation that wants him dead. The pressure, the loneliness, the constant danger, it all builds to a single, explosive confrontation on the summit of Mount Carmel. This is the peak, the zenith of his entire ministry, the moment that will define his legacy. God tells him it is time to face Ahab again. Elijah arranges a spectacular spiritual showdown. He challenges Ahab to gather all of Israel at Mount Carmel, along with Jezebel's personal retinue, 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah. He stands before the assembled nation, a lone figure against a sea of apostasy, and throws down the gauntlet. How long will you waver between two opinions? He thunders. If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. The people, cowed and uncertain, remain silent. So Elijah proposes a test, a definitive, undeniable contest. 2 bulls are to be prepared as sacrifices, one for Baal and one for the Lord. They will be cut into pieces and laid on wood, but no fire will be set to them. Then you call on the name of your God, Elijah says to the prophets of Baal, and I will call on the name of the Lord, the God who answers by fire. He is God. The terms are set. The stage is ready for the greatest miracle the nation has ever seen. What follows is a day of high drama, tinged with dark comedy. For hours, from morning until noon, the 450 prophets of Baal engage in their frantic ritual. They dance and limp around their altar, crying out, "Baal, answer us." But there is nothing, only silence. As the sun climbs to its zenith, Elijah begins to mercilessly mock them. His sarcasm is brutal. "Shout louder," he taunts them. Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened. His words whip them into a greater frenzy. They shout louder, and in their ecstatic desperation, they begin to slash themselves with swords and spears, a common practice in their cult, until their blood flows. They continue their desperate, bloody raving all afternoon, but there is no response, no voice, no one answers. Their God is silent, impotent, and absent. Then, as the time for the evening sacrifice approaches, Elijah steps forward. His actions are calm, deliberate, and deeply symbolic. He finds an old, ruined altar to the Lord and rebuilds it, using 12 stones, one for each of the tribes of Israel, a physical reminder of their broken covenant and their true identity. He digs a trench around the altar. He arranges the wood, cuts the bull into pieces, and lays it on the wood. And then he does something utterly insane in the middle of a 3-year drought. Fill 4 large jars with water, he commands, and pour it on the offering and on the wood. They do it. Do it again, he says. They do it again. Do it a 3rd time, he insists. They do it a 3rd time, until the sacrifice and the wood are completely saturated, and the trench around the altar is filled to the brim with precious water. He is making the miracle as impossible as it can be. There will be no doubt, no room for claims of trickery. With the stage perfectly set, Elijah steps forward and offers a simple, beautiful, powerful prayer. It is not a frantic shout, but a calm appeal to the God of his fathers. Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. And then it happens. The fire of the Lord falls from the clear sky. It is a terrifying, supernatural fire. It doesn't just burn the sacrifice, it consumes everything. The Bible says it burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the 12 stones of the altar, the soil underneath, and it even licked up all the water in the trench. It is a display of divine power so absolute, so overwhelming, that it annihilates any possible doubt. The people who had been silent all day see this and fall on their faces in terror and awe. A single, unified cry rises from the multitude. The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. The hearts of the people, for this one brief, shining moment, have turned back. Riding this wave of popular revival, Elijah gives a grim order. He has the 450 prophets of Baal seized, taken down to the Kishon Valley, and executed. It is a brutal, violent act, but in the context of the time, it was the final, bloody punctuation mark on God's victory. The cancer of Baal worship had been surgically, violently removed, but the day is not over. The drought is still upon the land. Elijah tells Ahab to go and eat, for there is the sound of a heavy rain. While the king goes to feast, Elijah climbs to the very top of Mount Carmel, folds himself into a posture of intense prayer, and sends his servant to look toward the sea. 6 times the servant goes and sees nothing, but Elijah persists. On the 7th time, the servant returns and says, "A cloud as small as a man's hand is rising from the sea." That is the sign. Elijah sends a message to Ahab to get in his chariot and go before the rain stops him. Soon, the sky grows black with clouds, the wind rises, and a torrential downpour begins, ending the 3.5-year drought. In a final, bizarre display of spirit-fueled power, Elijah tucks his cloak into his belt and outruns King Ahab's chariot all the way back to the royal city of Jezreel. He arrives like a conquering hero, a man vindicated by fire and water, the undisputed champion of Yahweh. He has faced down the king, defeated 450 false prophets, turned the heart of the nation, ended a drought, and outrun a horse-drawn chariot. He is at the absolute summit of his power and influence. He is untouchable. He is invincible. And then, in the space of a single verse, his entire world collapses. Ahab goes home and tells his wife, Jezebel, everything. He tells her about the contest, the fire, the rain, and how Elijah had killed all her prophets. Jezebel does not react like the people on the mountain. She is not filled with fear and awe. She is filled with a cold, pure, murderous rage. Her entire religious and political project is under threat. Her authority has been challenged. Her personal prophets are dead. She doesn't hesitate. She sends a messenger to find Elijah, the hero of the hour. The messenger delivers a short, chillingly personal oath. May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them. It is a death sentence, delivered with a deadline. This one woman, unmoved by the miracle, promises to do to Elijah what he did to her prophets. And the man who had stood fearlessly against an entire nation, the man who had mocked 450 armed fanatics, the man who had commanded the heavens to open, does the last thing we would ever expect him to do. He runs. The Bible says, Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. That one sentence is one of the most shocking and deeply human pivots in all of Scripture. Why was he afraid? He had just witnessed the power of God in a way that few humans ever have. Why would the threat of one woman, however powerful, send him into a panic? This is the crash. This is the brutal reality of spiritual, emotional, and physical burnout. Think about what Elijah had just been through. The years on the run, the constant stress of being a fugitive, the immense emotional and spiritual energy required for the confrontation on Mount Carmel, the physical exertion of the day's events, culminating in a superhuman marathon. He was utterly and completely depleted. He had poured out every last drop of his strength on that mountain, and now his tank was empty. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the confrontation had worn off, leaving behind a profound vulnerability, a deep, resonant exhaustion that settled in his bones. And in that depleted state, Jezebel's threat landed with devastating force. It was a confirmation of his deepest fear, that his great victory had ultimately changed nothing of substance. Yes, the people had been swayed for a moment, but the real power structure was still in place. Ahab was still king, and Jezebel, the true engine of the nation's apostasy, was still queen, and she was utterly unmoved. His spectacular success had not led to national repentance and reformation. It had led to a personal, targeted death threat. The system had not broken. It had just doubled down on its intention to destroy him. So he runs. He flees south out of the northern kingdom to Beersheba on the southern edge of Judah. He leaves his servant there and then continues on alone, a day's journey into the vast, empty wilderness of the Negev desert. He is deliberately isolating himself, pushing away his last human connection. He walks until he can walk no more, and then he collapses under the sparse shade of a solitary broom tree, a pathetic shrub in a landscape of utter desolation. And there, in the silence of the desert, the mighty prophet Elijah, the man of fire, prays a prayer of absolute despair. It is one of the darkest prayers in the Bible. "I have had enough, Lord," he whispers to the dust. "Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." Let's sit in the shade of that broom tree with him and listen to the anatomy of his doubt. I have had enough. This is the cry of catastrophic burnout. He has reached the absolute limit of his endurance. He has nothing left to give. He has fought the good fight. He has kept the faith, but he is done. The fight has taken everything from him, and he simply cannot go on. It's the despair of a soul that has given its all and found it wasn't enough. Take my life. This is more than just despair. It is suicidal ideation. The pain of continuing to live, of facing another day in a failed mission, feels greater than the fear of death. He's not asking for an honorable death in battle or a peaceful end in old age. He is asking God to actively end his suffering. He wants out. The prophet who could call down fire from heaven can see no other solution to his pain than to cease to exist. I am no better than my ancestors. This is the heart of it. This is a crisis of significance. He is looking back at his life, at the pinnacle of his ministry on Mount Carmel, and he is judging it a complete failure. His ancestors, the generations of Israelites who had failed to live up to the covenant, who had wavered and wandered, he sees himself as just one more in a long line of failures. The great victory on the mountain felt hollow. It didn't usher in the kingdom of God. It just got him a death threat. In his mind, all that fire and fury signified nothing. He felt profoundly and devastatingly alone. Later, he will articulate this feeling to God. I am the only one left. He believes he is the last faithful man in a nation of traitors, a solitary soldier fighting a war that has already been lost. His spectacular public success has led to a state of complete private collapse. He then lies down under the tree and falls asleep, an escape into unconsciousness. What happens next is a testament to the profound gentleness and wisdom of God. God's response to this broken, despairing, suicidal prophet is one of the most tender and compassionate moments in the Bible. God does not send a whirlwind to rebuke him. He does not send a lecture on the importance of faith. He does not tell him to get a grip and trust the promises. The first thing God does is address Elijah's physical needs. An angel touches him. A gentle physical connection in his profound isolation "Get up and eat," the angel says. Elijah looks, and there beside his head is a cake of bread baked on hot coals and a jar of water. A supernatural meal provided for him in the middle of nowhere. God knows that spiritual despair is often inextricably linked to physical exhaustion and depletion. Before he addresses Elijah's soul, he addresses his body. He gives him food. He gives him water. Elijah eats and drinks, and then lies down again, falling back into the deep sleep of the utterly exhausted. Sometime later, the angel comes back a second time, touches him again, and says, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." God recognizes the depth of his depletion. The journey ahead, not just the physical journey, but the journey back to wholeness, is too much for him in his current state. So he eats and drinks again. The Bible says that he was strengthened by that food, and he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. This journey is deeply symbolic. Horeb is another name for Mount Sinai. This is the place where Moses met God in the burning bush. This is where the law was given, where the covenant with Israel was forged. Elijah, in his crisis of faith, is making a pilgrimage back to the very roots of his faith, back to the place of foundational revelation. He is searching for an anchor in the storm of his despair. He finds a cave on the mountain and goes inside to spend the night, hiding himself in the rocks, just as he had been hiding from his calling. And it is there, in the darkness of the cave, that God finally speaks to him directly. And God's first words are not a statement, but a question. A gentle, probing, therapeutic question. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" God obviously knows what he is doing there. The question is for Elijah's benefit. It's an invitation for him to articulate his pain, to put words to his despair, to bring his broken narrative out into the light. And Elijah unloads. His answer is a torrent of self-pity, accusation, and loneliness. "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." This is the story he has been telling himself. It's a story with 3 key components. My great effort, I have been very zealous. Their great betrayal, the Israelites have rejected you. And my tragic solitude, I am the only one left, and they're trying to kill me. It's a narrative that casts himself as the lone hero in a world of villains, a victim whose faithfulness has been rewarded with persecution and the threat of death. And while there are elements of truth to it, it is a story completely devoid of hope, a story that has spiraled into the vortex of his own despair. God's response is not to argue with Elijah's version of events. Instead, he says, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." God is going to give him a new revelation, a new perspective on who God is and how he works in the world. What follows is a moment of profound theological teaching, delivered not through words, but through experience. A great and powerful wind, so strong that it shatters the rocks on the mountain, tears past Elijah. But the Lord is not in the wind. After the wind, there there is a mighty earthquake that shakes the very foundations of the mountain. But the Lord is not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, a raging fire sweeps past, reminiscent of the fire on Mount Carmel. But the Lord is not in the fire. Wind, earthquake, fire, these are the standard biblical symbols of theophany, of God's awesome, terrifying power. They are the language of Mount Carmel. This is the version of God that Elijah is most familiar with, the God of shock and awe, the God of spectacular, public displays of might. But God is deconstructing that image for him. He is showing him that his presence is not limited to the loud, the violent, the spectacular. Then, after the fire, there came a sound. The Hebrew is famously difficult to translate. Some versions say a still, small voice. Others say a gentle whisper, or the sound of a gentle stillness. It is the sound of quiet, the sound of presence without power, of intimacy without threat. And in that gentle whisper, Elijah recognizes the true presence of God. He pulls his cloak over his face in reverence and stands at the mouth of the cave. The voice comes to him again, asking the exact same question as before. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And, incredibly, Elijah gives the exact same pre-rehearsed answer, word for word. "I have been very zealous. I am the only one left." The great revelation of the still, small voice has not yet penetrated his well-rehearsed narrative of despair. He is stuck in his story. So God changes tactics. Since Elijah is stuck in the past, God gives him a future. He doesn't offer platitudes or comforting words. He gives him a job to do. He gives him a practical, forward-looking three-part commission that directly addresses the three core components of his despair. First, God tells him, "Go back the way you came. Anoint Hazael king over Aram. Also, anoint Jehu king over Israel." This directly counters Elijah's feeling that his work was a failure. God is telling him that the story is not over. God is still at work in the political realm, pulling down kings and raising up others, and he is going to use Elijah as his agent to do it. His life still has purpose. His work still has meaning. Second, God tells him, "And anoint Elisha son of Shaphat to succeed you as prophet." This is a direct antidote to his profound sense of loneliness and terminal significance. You are not the end of the line, Elijah. The prophetic work will not die with you. You are to find and train your own successor. You are to pass the mantle on. This single command shatters his isolation. He is no longer a solitary figure. He is part of a lineage, a vital link in a chain that will continue long after he is gone. Finally, God directly addresses the lie at the heart of Elijah's despair, the lie that he was completely alone. After giving him his new commission, God adds a stunning piece of information, a divine fact check on Elijah's feelings. "Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal, and whose mouths have not kissed him." 7,000. Elijah, in his despair, was off by a factor of 7,000. He felt alone, but his feelings were not facts. All along, there was a quiet, faithful remnant, a hidden community of believers who had stayed true. God had preserved them. They were not on Mount Carmel. They were not making a big show of their faith, but they were there, a testament to the power of the still, small voice at work in the hearts of ordinary people. Elijah was not the lone hero. He was simply the most visible member of a much larger, quieter movement. Armed with this new perspective, a new purpose, and a new community, both a successor and the knowledge of a remnant, Elijah leaves the mountain. The doubt and despair are not magically erased, but they have been answered. They have been met not with a rebuke, but with rest, with food, with a gentle question, with a new revelation of God's character, and with a practical, hopeful mission for the future. The story ends quietly. Elijah goes and finds Elisha plowing a field with a team of oxen. He walks up to him and throws his cloak, the symbol of his prophetic office, over Elisha's shoulders. A silent invitation, a passing of the torch, and Elisha accepts. The solitary prophet is no longer alone. The man who prayed for death under a broom tree now has a companion for the road ahead, a future for his ministry, and a newfound purpose given to him, not in the fire and the earthquake, but in the gentle, life-giving whisper of a God who meets us not only in our victories, but more importantly, in our deepest moments of despair. We've seen doubt born of inadequacy in Moses, doubt that demanded tangible proof in Gideon, and doubt that festered from the burnout and loneliness of a spiritual warrior in Elijah. Each story reveals a different facet of the human struggle with faith. But now, we venture into a territory that is, in some ways, even more unsettling. We come to a doubt that is not born of weakness, fear, or exhaustion, but of immense strength and conviction. It is a theological crisis, a shaking of the very foundations of a man whose entire identity was built on absolute, unshakable certainty. This is the doubt that arises when our clearest, most righteous expectations of who God is and how he should act collide with a reality that looks nothing like we imagined. For this, we must go to a grim fortress prison, to a man in chains, a man who was supposed to be the herald of the king, but now finds himself questioning if he even announced the right person. This is the profound and painful doubt of John the Baptist. To feel the true weight of John's question, you must first understand the man of certainty he was. You have to breathe the air of the world he burst into. First-century Judea was a pressure cooker of religious fervor and political desperation. For centuries, the Jewish people had been under the boot of one foreign empire after another: the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, and now the Romans. Their land was occupied, their people were taxed into poverty, and their sense of national pride was a constantly throbbing wound. Yet, burning beneath the surface of this humiliation was a fierce, unquenchable hope, a hope rooted in the promises of their sacred scriptures. They were waiting for a Messiah, an anointed one sent from God, who would come and set things right. But what would this Messiah look like? The expectations were varied and often contradictory. Some hoped for a new King David, a brilliant military strategist who would raise an army, drive the Romans into the sea, and restore the political kingdom of Israel to its former glory. Others looked for a priestly figure who would purify the corrupt temple and restore true worship. Still others, reading the more apocalyptic texts, expected a celestial, supernatural warrior who would descend from the heavens to judge the wicked, destroy their enemies with fire, and establish God's reign on earth with overwhelming force. But a common thread ran through most of these hopes. The Messiah would be a figure of immense power, a bringer of judgment, a great disruptor who would fundamentally reorder the world in Israel's favor. They were waiting for a king, a judge, a revolutionary. Into this tense, expectant world, John the Baptist emerges, not from a palace or a seminary, but from the wilderness. He is a figure straight from the pages of the Old Testament, a throwback to the great, wild prophets of old. His very appearance is a sermon. He is clothed in camel's hair, with a leather belt around his waist, the traditional garb of a prophet, like Elijah. He rejects the comforts of civilization, surviving on a diet of locusts and wild honey. He is a man wholly set apart, his body as rugged and uncompromising as his message. He is not a man you would invite to a dinner party. He is a man who makes you feel deeply uncomfortable with your own compromises. And his message is pure, uncut fire. He doesn't set up his pulpit in the city, in the synagogues. He preaches by the Jordan River in the wilderness, forcing the people to leave their comfortable routines and come out to him, to the symbolic place of new beginnings for Israel. And when they come, he does not offer them comforting platitudes. He confronts them with a demand for radical, urgent change. Repent, he roars, for the kingdom of heaven has come near. He speaks of a coming judgment that is not distant, but imminent. The axe is already at the root of the trees, he warns, and every tree that does not produce good fruit will be cut down and thrown into the fire. He looks at the religious leaders, the Pharisees and Sadducees, who come out to observe him, and he greets them not with respect, but with a scathing insult. You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the coming wrath? There is no ambiguity in John. He is a man of stark binaries, good fruit and bad fruit, wheat and chaff, the kingdom and the fire. His baptism in the Jordan is a baptism of repentance, a symbolic washing for those who confess their sins and commit to turning their lives around before the great and terrible day of judgment arrives. But the central driving force of his entire ministry is that he is not the main event. He is the warm-up act. He is the forerunner, the herald, the one sent to prepare the way for someone infinitely greater. His testimony about the coming Messiah is filled with images of awesome, terrifying power. After me comes the one more powerful than I, he declares, the straps of whose sandals I am not worthy to stoop down and untie. He speaks of his own inadequacy in the most humble terms, positioning himself as less than a slave to the one who is to come. And the work of this Messiah, it will be a baptism not of water, but of the Holy Spirit and fire. He continues with a vivid, terrifying image of judgment. His winnowing fork is in his hand, and he will clear his thrashing floor gathering his wheat into the barn and burning up the chaff with unquenchable fire. This is John's expectation, crystal clear and preached with ferocious conviction. The Messiah he is announcing is a judge, a purifier, a powerful agent of divine wrath who will separate the righteous from the wicked with fiery finality. This is the figure he has prepared the nation to meet. And then one day, the Messiah arrives. Jesus comes from Galilee to the Jordan to be baptized by John. John, in a moment of profound spiritual insight, recognizes him instantly, and he is horrified. His sense of propriety is deeply shaken. "I need to be baptized by you," he protests. "And do you come to me?" John understands his own sinfulness and Jesus' purity. The roles are reversed. It feels wrong. But Jesus insists, "Let it be so now. It is proper for us to do this to fulfill all righteousness." John obeys. He takes the Son of God into the waters of the Jordan and baptizes him. And at that moment, John is given the most profound, direct, and unambiguous confirmation anyone could ever receive. The heavens are torn open. The Spirit of God descends on Jesus in the physical form of a dove, and a voice from heaven, the voice of God the Father, booms across the river. "You are my Son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased." John saw it all. He heard it all. He was the sole human witness to the divine anointing of the Messiah. Any trace of doubt he might have had was obliterated in that moment of celestial revelation. From that day forward, his testimony is no longer about a nameless one who is to come. It is about a specific person. When he sees Jesus the next day, he points him out to his own disciples and declares, "Look, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world." And he explains the foundation of his certainty. "The one who sent me to baptize with water told me, 'The man on whom you see the Spirit come down and remain is the one who will baptize with the Holy Spirit.' I have seen, and I testify that this is God's chosen one. There is no more certain man on the planet than John the Baptist at this moment. He has heard the audible voice of God. He has seen the visible descent of the Spirit. His life's purpose has been fulfilled. He has correctly identified and announced the Messiah. He has done his job. He points his own followers toward Jesus, saying, 'He must become greater, I must become less.' He is a man who understands his role and has executed it with perfect, courageous fidelity. But a prophet's job is not just to announce the coming of God. It is to speak truth to human power. And this is what leads to John's downfall. His uncompromising righteousness compels him to publicly confront the local ruler, Herod Antipas, a tetrarch appointed by Rome. Herod had divorced his own wife to marry Herodias, the wife of his half-brother Philip. It was a scandalous, adulterous, and incestuous affair that violated Jewish law. While others whispered, John shouted. He publicly rebuked Herod for his sin. Prophets who challenge corrupt kings rarely remain free for long. Herod, enraged and perhaps pressured by his new wife, has John arrested. He is taken from the wide-open spaces of the wilderness and thrown into a dungeon, most likely in the grim, forbidding fortress of Machaerus. This fortress was perched on a desolate hilltop on the eastern side of the Dead Sea, a place of blistering heat and profound isolation. The fiery man of the desert, the voice crying in the wilderness, is now silenced, caged in a dark stone cell. The horizon of his world has shrunk from the vast expanse of the desert to the few feet of a prison floor. He is powerless, cut off from his followers, his ministry abruptly and brutally terminated. And it is here, in the cold, silent darkness of the prison, that the doubt begins to grow. His own disciples are allowed to visit him, and they bring him news from the outside world. They tell him what Jesus is doing. They tell him about the miracles, the teachings, the crowds. And as John sits in his cell, listening to these reports, a terrible, sickening dissonance begins to grow in his mind. Stories he is hearing do not line up with the Messiah he had so confidently proclaimed. He had preached of an axe and a winnowing fork, of judgment and unquenchable fire. But Jesus isn't wielding an axe. He's healing lepers. He's making the lame walk. John had announced a mighty judge who would separate the wheat from the chaff. But Jesus is actively seeking out the chaff, the tax collectors, the prostitutes, the sinners, and he's not judging them. He's eating dinner with them. John had preached of a coming wrath. Jesus is preaching about loving your enemies and turning the other cheek. Imagine John's confusion. Where is the fiery baptism? Where is the judgment on the corrupt leaders of Israel? Where is the confrontation with the Roman occupiers? This Jesus seems so gentle, so merciful. His power is being used not to destroy, but to heal, not to condemn, but to restore. This was not the program John had signed up for. This was not the Messiah he had announced. Adding to his theological confusion is his own personal situation. He, the Messiah's forerunner, is rotting in prison. The greatest of the prophets is chained up at the whim of a petty, adulterous tyrant. If Jesus really is the all-powerful Messiah, why isn't he doing something about this? A word from him could bring down the walls of Machaerus. A single command could strike Herod dead. But from Jesus, there is only silence. John's own suffering becomes a powerful argument against Jesus' messianic identity. The Messiah was supposed to proclaim freedom for the captives, and yet his own herald remains a captive. The dissonance becomes unbearable. The darkness of the prison, the pain of his own suffering, and the confusing reports of Jesus' ministry all conspire to erode his once unshakable certainty. The foundation of his entire life begins to crack. Was he wrong? Could he, the man who heard the voice of God, have made a catastrophic mistake? Did he misunderstand the signs? Did he point a whole generation of hopeful people to the wrong man? From this place of profound spiritual agony, John sends 2 of his disciples on a desperate mission. They are to find Jesus and ask him a single, devastating question, a question that represents the total collapse of John's certainty. The question is, are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else? Let the weight of that question sink in. This is not an academic inquiry. This is the agonized cry of a man whose world has been turned upside down. It's the question of the witness, who is now starting to doubt what he saw with his own eyes. It's the sound of a prophet questioning his own prophecy. The phrase, "the one who is to come," was John's own term for the Messiah. He is now using his own language of certainty to express his most profound uncertainty. Jesus, my entire life has been about you. I pointed the way to you. And now, from this prison cell, nothing makes sense. My reality doesn't match my expectations. Please, just tell me, did I get it right? John's disciples find Jesus. He is in the middle of his ministry, curing many who had diseases, sicknesses, and evil spirits, and giving sight to many who were blind. They deliver their master's heavy question. Jesus' response is a model of pastoral wisdom and gentle correction. He doesn't give them a simple yes or no, which could be easily dismissed. He also doesn't rebuke John for his doubt, which would have crushed a man who was already broken. Instead, he turns to tangible evidence. He tells them, "Go back and report to John what you have seen and heard." He gives them a specific list of his activities, a portfolio of his messianic work. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed to Thepor. This list is not random. Every single item on it is a direct echo of prophecies about the Messianic age, particularly from the book of Isaiah. In Isaiah 35, the prophet foretells a time when the eyes of the blind will be opened and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then will the lame leap like a deer. In Isaiah 61, the Messianic figure declares that the Spirit of the Lord is on him to proclaim good news to the poor, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives. Jesus is essentially sending John a coded message, a message that only a man steeped in the scriptures would fully understand. He's saying, "John, I know you were expecting the Messiah of judgment from passages like Malachi 3. You were looking for the winnowing fork and the fire, but you overlooked these other prophecies. You had a partial picture of my mission. The scriptures also speak of a Messiah who would come to heal, to restore, to bring good news to the marginalized. My work is not a contradiction of the prophecies. It is a fulfillment of a different set of prophecies that you weren't focused on. Go back and reread your Bible. The evidence is right there. My identity is confirmed not by the kind of power you expected, but by the kind of compassion the prophets foretold." He is gently expanding John's theological framework. He is showing him that the Messiah's mission is bigger and more surprising than he had imagined. The kingdom is not arriving, at least not at first, with a sword and a fire, but with a healing touch and a message of hope for the poor. The judgment John preached is real, but it is not the first chapter of the story. The first chapter is grace. Jesus adds one final, poignant sentence to his message for John. "Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me." The Greek word for stumble here is scandalizomai, from which we get our word scandal. It means to be tripped up, to be offended, to have your faith derailed. Jesus is acknowledging the scandal of his own ministry. He knows he is not the Messiah anyone was expecting. His table fellowship with sinners was scandalous. His message of non-retaliation was scandalous. His lack of political ambition was scandalous. His refusal to conform to the popular image of a conquering hero was the greatest stumbling block of all. With this final sentence, he is speaking directly to John's heart. John, I know this is hard. I know I am not who you thought I would be. I understand why you are stumbling, why you are offended by my methods. But blessed are you if you can hold on. Blessed are you if you can trust me, even when you don't understand me. Blessed are you if your faith can be bigger than your expectations. It is a profound invitation to a deeper, more resilient faith, one that can endure confusion and apparent contradiction. The story could end there, with John's disciples returning to the prison with this cryptic but comforting answer. But what Jesus does next is perhaps the most beautiful part of the entire episode. As soon as John's disciples have walked away, before they are even out of earshot, Jesus turns to the crowd that has been watching all this unfold. He knows they have just witnessed the great John the Baptist, the Iron Man of conviction, express a moment of profound doubt. He knows they might be tempted to dismiss him, to see him as weak or a fraud. So Jesus immediately launches into the most powerful defense and effusive praise of John that can be imagined. What did you go out into the wilderness to see? He asks the crowd. A reed swayed by the wind. In other words, did you think John was a man of no conviction, easily bent by popular opinion or political pressure? You know he is not. If not, what did you go out to see? A man dressed in fine clothes? No, those who wear expensive clothes and live in luxury are in palaces. He contrasts John's prophetic austerity with the corruption of Herod's court. Then he builds to his stunning conclusion. What then did you go out to see? A prophet. Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. This is the one about whom it is written, I will send my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way before you. He confirms that John is the prophesied forerunner from Malachi. And then, the ultimate praise. Truly, I tell you, among those born of women, there has not risen anyone greater than John the Baptist. Think about the timing and the grace of this statement. At the precise moment that John is at his lowest ebb, at his most vulnerable, when his faith is faltering in a dark prison cell, Jesus is publicly declaring him to be the greatest man who has ever lived. He does not define John by his moment of doubt. He does not see his question as a failure. Jesus understands that a man can be the greatest of all prophets and still be plagued by doubt when his world unravels. He sees John's whole life, his courage, his faithfulness, his uncompromising witness, and he honors it. He teaches us that doubt is not the opposite of faith. It can be a painful, agonizing part of it. A person's greatness is not measured by the absence of struggle, but by the lifetime of fidelity that surrounds it. The story, of course, does not have a happy ending in the worldly sense. Jesus' message to John was a reassurance for his soul, not a promise of rescue for his body. John is not miraculously freed. He remains in that prison until, at a drunken birthday party for Herod, Herodias' daughter dances for the king, and he rashly promises her anything she wants. Prompted by her vengeful mother, she asks for the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And Herod, to save face, agrees. The great prophet is unceremoniously executed. His life ended not for a grand cause, but as a sordid party favor. His doubt was answered, but his suffering was not alleviated. His faith was clarified, but his circumstances did not change. This is the final, hard lesson of John's doubt. Following the Messiah is not a guarantee of an easy life or a triumphant end. John's greatness was not that he escaped the prison, but that he was faithful even unto death, wrestling with the most profound questions about God's plan right up to the end. He was the man who was certain enough to announce the king, but also humble and honest enough to ask for help when the king's actions confused him. And in his honest doubt, and in Jesus' compassionate response, we find a profound hope for our own moments of confusion, when the God we experience doesn't seem to be the God we expected. We have journeyed through some of the loneliest and most desperate landscapes of the human soul. We felt the weight of inadequacy with Moses at the foot of a burning mountain. We paced a thrashing floor through a long night of anxiety with Gideon begging for proof. We collapsed in suicidal despair under a broom tree with Elijah, crushed by the weight of a hollow victory. We languished in a prison cell with John the Baptist, our most cherished certainties dissolving into agonizing questions. Each of these stories has shown us that doubt is not a sign of a weak faith, but often a painful companion to a deep and honest one. And now we arrive at our final story. It is, in many ways, the climax of the entire conversation, because it takes us into the very heart of the Christian claim, and it confronts the one doubt that feels most at home in our modern, scientific world: the demand for cold, hard, physical evidence. This is the story of Thomas, a man whose name has become synonymous with doubt, but whose story is truly one of courageous loyalty, profound grief, and the greatest confession of faith ever uttered. To understand Thomas's doubt, you must first immerse yourself in the atmosphere of the days after the crucifixion. It is vital to strip away the 2,000 years of Easter hymns and joyful traditions, and feel the raw, unfiltered horror of that weekend as the disciples experienced it. This was not a time of hopeful expectation. It was a time of catastrophic, soul-crushing trauma. Their master, their friend, the man they believed was the promised Messiah of Israel, had been arrested, subjected to a sham trial, brutally tortured, and then executed in the most shameful and agonizing manner the Roman Empire had devised. They had watched him die. They had seen the spear thrust into his side to confirm his death. They had seen his limp, broken body taken down from the cross and hastily sealed in a tomb. For 3 years, their entire world had revolved around this man. They had left their homes, their families, their careers to follow him. They had listened to his teachings, witnessed his miracles, and placed all their hopes for their own futures and the future of their nation squarely on his shoulders. They believed he was the one who would establish the kingdom of God. And now he was dead. The movement was over. The dream had died, and not just died, but been grotesquely murdered, leaving them as the disgraced followers of a failed, executed Messiah. On that first Easter evening, they are not gathered in joyful prayer, anticipating a miracle. They are huddled together in a room in Jerusalem, the doors locked and barred. The mood in that room would have been thick with grief, confusion, and above all, fear. The same authorities who had killed Jesus knew who they were. They were his inner circle. It was only a matter of time before the soldiers came for them, too. Every footstep in the street outside, every distant shout, would have sent a jolt of terror through them. They were fugitives, their lives in imminent danger, their hopes completely and utterly shattered. This was not the antechamber of the resurrection. It was the wake of a tragedy. And it is into this context that we must place Thomas. The man we call Doubting Thomas is too often painted as a grumbling pessimist, a congenital curmudgeon. But the Gospel of John, the only gospel that gives him a distinct personality, paints a far more compelling picture. We meet him in 3 key moments, and they reveal a man of fierce loyalty, pragmatic honesty, and profound devotion. The first glimpse we get is in John chapter 11. Jesus has just received news that his friend Lazarus is sick, but he delays his journey. By the time he decides to go to Bethany, in Judea, Lazarus is already dead. The other disciples are terrified. They know that the religious authorities in Judea are actively seeking to kill Jesus. To go back there is to walk directly into a trap. "Rabbi," they plead, "a short while ago the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you are going back." It is a perfectly logical and self-preservative argument. But Jesus is resolved. And as the other disciples hesitate, paralyzed by fear, it is Thomas who speaks up. He turns to the others and says, with a kind of grim courage, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." This is not the statement of a cynic. This is the cry of a man whose loyalty to Jesus is absolute, a man who would rather die alongside his master than live safely without him. He is a ride-or-die disciple. He fully expects the journey to end in their deaths, but his commitment is so total that he is willing to face it. He is a man of courageous, if perhaps fatalistic, love. Our second glimpse is at the Last Supper in John chapter 14. Jesus is preparing his disciples for his departure. He speaks in soaring, poetic language about going to prepare a place for them in his Father's house. And then he says, with a kind of divine assumption, "You know the way to the place where I am going." In the midst of what was likely a confused and reverent silence, with the other disciples probably nodding along, not wanting to appear foolish, it is Thomas who has the courage to be honest. "Lord," he says bluntly, "we don't know where you are going, so how can we know the way?" This is not a statement of doubt, but a plea for clarity. Thomas is a pragmatist, a realist. He doesn't do well with vague spiritual metaphors. He needs a roadmap. He is the student in the classroom who is not afraid to raise his hand and say, "I don't get it." His question is not disrespectful. It is born of a genuine desire to understand. It is this honest, pragmatic question that prompts Jesus to give one of his most profound and famous answers. I am the way and the truth and the life. Thomas's practical honesty created the space for a deeper revelation. So the man we meet after the crucifixion is not a born skeptic. He is a man of fierce loyalty, a man who was prepared to die with Jesus, and a man who needed to understand things in a concrete, honest way. Now, try to imagine the depth of his grief. For a man whose loyalty was so total, the death of his master would not just be a disappointment, it would be a shattering of his entire being. The world would have lost all its meaning. His pragmatism would have reinforced the brutal finality of it all. He had seen death. He knew what a Roman cross did to a human body. For him, there was no ambiguity. It was over. On that first Easter evening, when the resurrected Jesus appears to his terrified disciples in the locked room, Thomas is not there. The Bible doesn't tell us why. Perhaps he was the one brave enough to go out for food. Perhaps the collective grief was too much for him, and he had gone off to mourn in solitude, as his loyal heart was likely broken in a way the others could not comprehend. Whatever the reason, his absence is critical. He misses the collective experience. He is not part of the group's journey from terror to joy. So when the other 10 disciples find him later, they are ecstatic, transformed. They burst upon his private world of grief with the most incredible, unbelievable news. We have seen the Lord. Put yourself in Thomas's shoes. You are at the absolute nadir of your life. Your world has ended. And your friends, who you know are just as traumatized and grief-stricken as you are, come to you with a story that sounds like a mass hallucination, a shared delusion born of wishful thinking and unbearable sorrow. They saw him, alive. It would have sounded like madness. His pragmatic, realistic mind, the same mind that needed to know the way to the Father's house, could not process this. It violated every law of nature and experience he knew. Dead men do not come back to life. His response is not one of gentle skepticism. It is a raw, absolute, almost violent rejection of their story. It is a defiant statement born of a broken heart, a protective wall of disbelief thrown up to guard against the possibility of any more false hope. Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, he declares, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. Let's dissect this famous demand, because it is far more than simple doubt. It is a profound theological statement. First, it is a demand for empirical, sensory evidence of the highest order. He doesn't just need to see, he needs to touch. He needs to physically interact with the resurrected body. This is the cry of the realist, the man who trusts what his senses can confirm. In a world of ghosts and visions, he needs something solid. Second, and most importantly, notice what he demands to touch. He demands to touch the wounds. He doesn't say, unless I see him walking and talking. He says, unless I put my finger in the nail marks and my hand in his side. Why? Because Thomas needs to know that the resurrected Jesus is the same person as the crucified Jesus. He needs to know that the resurrection is not a do-over, not a replacement, not a phantom that looks like Jesus, but the redemption of the very body that suffered. The wounds are the evidence of his identity. They are the bridge that connects the horror of Good Friday with the impossible glory of Easter. Thomas, in his grief, intuits a central truth of the faith. Our hope is not in a God who erases suffering, but in a God who bears the marks of that suffering in his own glorified body and redeems it. He needs to touch the pain to believe in the victory. And finally, his declaration is an ultimatum. I will not believe. O me pistiuso. It's an emphatic double negative in the Greek, the strongest way of saying, I will absolutely not believe. He has drawn a line in the sand. This is his non-negotiable condition for faith. So for an entire week, the other disciples live in the light of their newfound joy, while Thomas remains in the darkness of his doubt. Imagine the isolation of that week. He would have been the ghost at their feast, the one sober person at a joyous party. They would have talked excitedly about what they saw, and he would have sat in the corner, his grief curdling into a stubborn, lonely skepticism. That week of waiting was his wilderness, his prison cell. It was a week of wrestling, a week where his doubt was allowed to reach its fullest, most defiant expression before it could be met by grace. Then a week later, the disciples are gathered again. The doors are still locked, a sign that their fear has not entirely vanished. And this time, Thomas is with them. And just as before, Jesus suddenly stands in their midst. He gives them his customary greeting, peace be with you. And then, without waiting for a word from anyone, he turns his full attention to Thomas. He has heard the demand that Thomas made in his absence. He knows the precise conditions that Thomas has set for his belief. And in an act of breathtaking intimacy and condescension, he addresses Thomas directly, mirroring his own defiant words back to him as a gentle invitation. Put your finger here, Jesus says. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. He is offering Thomas exactly what he demanded. He holds out his wounded hands. He exposes the gash in his side. He is not ashamed of his scars. He offers them as the very heart of his revelation. The glorified, resurrected Lord of the universe invites his doubting, grieving friend to touch his brokenness. This is not a God who stands at a distance, demanding faith. This is a God who comes close, who enters into our doubt, and who offers his own vulnerability as the ultimate reason to believe. He meets Thomas's demand for proof not with a rebuke, but with a radical, loving invitation into his own suffering. And then he adds, stop doubting and believe. It's not a harsh command, but a gentle plea. Thomas, let go of the pain that is holding you back. Let belief in. The Bible, in its profound subtlety, never actually tells us if Thomas touched him. The text implies that the sight of his master, alive and offering his wounds, was enough. The sheer reality of Jesus' presence, the love in his eyes, the intimacy of the offer, it shatters Thomas's wall of doubt in an instant. All his defiant conditions, All his pragmatic objections melt away in the face of this overwhelming reality. And Thomas's response is not a cool intellectual acknowledgement. It is not, "Ah, I see, my hypothesis is confirmed." It is an explosion of worship, a cry that comes from the very depths of his soul. He falls to his knees and utters what is arguably the single most profound and complete statement of faith in all the four Gospels. He looks at the wounded man standing before him and declares, "My Lord and my God, ho kyrios mu kai ho theos mu." He is the first disciple to explicitly call Jesus God. The man who had the greatest doubt arrives at the deepest confession. His journey through the dark valley of skepticism and grief has led him not just back to belief, but to a height of revelation that surpassed that of the others. They had said, "We have seen the Lord." Thomas sees his Lord and his God. His insistence on confronting the brutal reality of the crucifixion allowed him to grasp the full, staggering reality of the resurrection. Jesus accepts his worship. And then he speaks a final word, a word that is for Thomas, but is also for every single person who has ever read this story since. "Because you have seen me, you have believed," Jesus says. "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." This is not a rebuke. It is not Jesus saying, "It would have been better if you had just believed, Thomas." It is a gentle acknowledgement of the path Thomas had to take. His was the path of seeing. But in the same breath, Jesus pronounces a special blessing, a new beatitude for all the future generations. A blessing for us. He knows that from this point forward, the vast majority of believers will not have the luxury of touching his wounds. We will have to rely on the testimony of these witnesses. Our faith will have to be in something we have not seen. Jesus is inaugurating the age of faith, the age of trusting the story, of believing the testimony of the community, of finding life not in what our eyes can see or our hands can touch, but in the reality of a person who lives on in the hearts of his people. He carves out a special place of honor for all who dare to believe without seeing. And with that, our journey through the honest doubts of these biblical giants comes to an end. We started with Moses, hiding his face, convinced he was the wrong man for the job, and God answered him not by boosting his ego, but by promising his presence. We sat with Gideon, demanding sign after sign, and God in his patience met him, building his faith piece by piece until he was ready to face an army with 300 men. We found Elijah under a tree, praying for death, and God answered him not with a lecture, but with bread and water and sleep, and finally with a still, small voice and a new purpose. We heard the cry from John's prison cell, the agony of a man whose expectations were shattered, and Jesus answered him not with a jailbreak, but with a gentle rereading of the scriptures and a public declaration of his greatness. And finally, with Thomas, we stand before the risen Christ, confronting our most basic empirical need for proof. And Jesus answers that need with an invitation into his own wounds, showing us that our faith is not in a God who is immune to suffering, but in a God who bears the scars of it forever. The final lesson is this: These men are not heroes of the faith because they were free from doubt. They are heroes because they were honest about it. They wrestled, they questioned, they despaired, and they demanded. And in every case, God met them not with anger at their doubt, but with a grace that was tailored to their specific need. Their stories give us permission to be human. They invite us to bring our own inadequacy, our own need for proof, our burnout, our shattered expectations, and our demand for evidence honestly before God. For it is often not in the absence of doubt, but in the courageous, honest wrestling with it, that we, like Thomas, fall to our knees and find ourselves confessing, with a conviction we never thought possible, my Lord and my God. Blessed are we who have not seen, and yet are invited to believe.